with regards to education, I've always been, a huge critic of the fact that we've been taught a lot of lies, outright lies, right? Like I was very surprised when I came across, and I think he's the only one who's spoken about it, Sanjeev Sanyal discussing that Ashoka was already converted to Buddhism before the Kalinga massacre happened, before he executed the Kalinga massacre. And of course, we know that he sent out Rahul and Sanghamitra, his children, to Ceylon then, Sri Lanka, modern day Sri Lanka, and other parts of the country to sort of forcefully take up Buddhism and to convert, etc. So this whole myth around Ashoka having, converted to a more peaceful religion, as if, his existing religion did not have peace as a concept. And then, of course, we have the contradiction of Gandhi and Ahimsa taking one of the many millions of concepts to an extreme. But yeah, you have one version of Hinduism or the Indic civilizational value system being nonviolent, and then suggesting that the only way for Ashoka to achieve nonviolence was the creation of myth building around Buddhism being what provides, Ashoka that armor of nonviolence or peaceful behavior. So so that was, one of the lies. And then when I came across, understanding a deeper understanding of AIT and what it meant, it just seems like it seems a little too cruel to subject children to that sort of social experimentation, to have baseless something that's not that's already in discussions in schools and at a very high level within people from varied fields in genetics, in archaeology, in linguistics, discussing that, and then giving them a very indoctrinated sort of version of what they should believe before they know what to believe. So yeah, I think could you just outline the political impact of AIT, and growing up as somebody who's imbibed those things, what do you think the impact of AIT in children would be? That the Dravidian Aryan divide and all of these things are something that is played up by politics, political parties at every level, by media, and people really want to believe in those things as a sort of supremacist ideology. And we've got them from both sides. It's not that there are no Aryan supremacists. There's a lot of them as well. So yeah, what do you think the impact of AIT is on us as a people in the everyday lives, and how we make decisions, how we see ourselves as on the global stage?
Yeah, so I think we can think of the impact in two boxes, right? One is the sociological impact, where AIT achieves what so many other distortions of Indian history and Indian culture achieve, which is to make modern Indians ashamed of their own ancestors. And it makes modern Indians either ashamed of their ancestors, either it makes us hate our ancestors, or at the very least, it makes us distance and disassociate ourselves with our ancestors. Now, the sociological impact of that on an individual, on a community, on how things can change if you raise one generation in this way is already known. And I mean, there have been great scholars like Anand Kumaraswamy who have already talked about this, that what happens when, and this has happened not just in India, this has happened the world over, where all pre-Abrahamic civilizations, that's what Professor Bal Gangadhar talks about, that what we call religion has actually arisen by making people spurn what is their tradition.
Right.
So you cannot actually convert to religion without basically stamping on the graves or graves of your own ancestors. So that's the first one. And I think it impacts us as we grow up in all kinds of ways. I mean, because of what I learned about things like this, about casteism, you grow up learning that, my Brahmin ancestors enslaved an entire subcontinent of people and forced them to live under some kind of caste hegemony. So then there's no respect I will have for my grandparents' customs that they follow today.
2%. The 2% did that. The 2% did that. So.
Yeah.
But I can't say that anymore. They're just minorities, as long as they do have political power, and the Brahmins did at certain points, and in certain regions they still do. But yeah,
It's not
So
suddenly as reductive or black and white,
absolutely
or it's
not.
not the grand narrative that we are taught.
Yes. And that
And then, of
disregards
course,
completely the whole idea, the whole, jati varna system. That's not discussed at all because
absolutely,
it's just covered up by caste.
absolutely.
But yeah, how would AIT play into, just for the viewers, how would AIT play into these concepts?
Well, so it creates, first of all, two very direct fault lines, right? Fault line number one between indigenous and invader.
Mhm.
So we have people in India who we call Adivasis, and even the latest genetics papers try to say that, oh, there are people in India who are Brahmins who have come from the Russian steppe, or whose ancestors did. So this creates a fault line which need not exist, which has never existed in India, which has never been talked about by our ancestors in their past. So it's an illusory but divisive fault line. The second one, I mean, we have in Tamil Nadu today, we have political parties with the name Dravidian.
Yeah.
So Aryan and Dravidian is not even a real thing. These are false categories created by our colonizers. But today we have modern politics still playing out along those divisive fault lines. And we have, strains of Tamil separatism based around that. We have ideas of, Harappan civilization being a Dravidian civilization, Vedic civilization being a foreigner Aryan civilization. So again, that's a very divisive fault line which need not exist, which never existed in our past. The word Dravid itself is a Sanskrit word, and it was used in Sanskrit literature only in a regional sense, in no other sense at all. So these are two very real fault lines, of course. And more fundamentally, it's stealing from us our own history. It's stealing from us our place as a heavyweight of civilization, of demographics, of agricultural, technological innovation in the ancient past, which archaeology attests to. So it creates this split civilization, as if, I think it's maybe Sanjeev Sanyal has also talked about it, but definitely Dr. David Frawley. He talks about this weird paradox that you have a civilization like the Indus Valley civilization. It's larger in surface area than its contemporary Egyptian and Mesopotamian Sumerian civilizations combined. So it covers a much larger area, but you have no writing from it. You have no literature from it. Even its language is not deciphered. And at the parallel, you have this great literature called the Vedic literature, the Sanskrit literature, but you don't seem to have any material or archaeological record of it. And what we're taught is that these are two separate things, whereas the obvious stares us in the face that they were all overlapping strains within this, civilizational heavyweight that the subcontinent has been, as far as we can discernibly go.
Yes, Dr. Frawley has also spoken extensively on this, and I'm glad that at least there's a discussion. I just wish it would end soon. I mean, you would think that with actual excavations like in Rakhigarhi and I think there were several others that have proven this to be completely a farce that has, caused the invasion to come down to migration to come down to now trickling, and then tourism. I don't really know where it'll end up with. But then, should there be a point where you just say that, hey, this is just a made-up thing, and it should the first step is to remove it from school textbooks?
Well, yes, I mean, ideally, that's the point where we should be at, where we don't have to be shouting AIT, OIT every day. Every day some new person realizes it, writes a whole Twitter thread about it, some new person rediscovers it, and then again, there's a debate happening. Ideally, we need to get past all of this. Definitely at a civilizational and national level, there are bigger, deeper policy issues that we have to worry about.
Absolutely.
This is just one aspect of a historical narrative. But for a narrative to die a death, no grand narrative like this will die a natural death, especially because there are always people who have staked decades of reputations, careers, book deals on this grand narrative. So it will have to, face an equal, if not greater, counter grand narrative before we reach a balance again. So if things have tilted so much in one direction, we have to tilt them equally in the other direction for the seesaw to be aligned again. So that will have to happen, and of course it's happening.
So we hold Max Mueller in very high regard. Of course, we have the Max Mueller Bhavans and all of that. So for the viewers, what would you like to discuss about his role in promulgating the foundations of AIT, mostly in India? Yeah.
To be very honest, I think that if we still continue to talk about Max Mueller,
Hmm?
what we're revealing is that we haven't kept abreast with the changes in this debate over the last few decades. The fact is that far more, there's no point talking about now Max Mueller, whether he was racist, whether he was driven by Christianity, whether he was driven by a kind of bigotry towards India or Hinduism. None of that matters. We should be talking about modern scholars. We should be talking about Michael Witzel. We should be talking about David Reich. We should be talking about Heinz Henrik Hock, Asko Parpola. And we should be talking about, of course, people in India such as Tony Joseph, who are helping perpetrate those narratives afresh with new inputs from genetics or whatever. That's where the landscape currently is, and we can keep countering Max Mueller. It doesn't matter. We have to counter today's scholars. We have to counter people who look at the latest genetic finding and again use it for the same old silly narratives. We have to counter people who have not been even doing justice to counter narratives from the Indian side. So whether it is Srikant Talageri, and I genuinely believe, as
Hmm.
there's another scholar, Dr. Conrad Elst. So Dr.
Yes,
Conrad
of
Elst
course.
has said that Srikant Talageri has single-handedly won the RN invasion theory debate.
Hmm.
And that's absolutely true. So we have to now talk about this. It doesn't matter what Max Mueller said all those decades ago. It matters what Witzels and Parpolas are doing even today. That's the relevant landscape.
I would disagree because, like you said, that history does. If we were to see it as a consciousness, then we need to see history as that. So, uh, since we are discussing history, and he was one of the first proponents, and somebody who is more well regarded in India. I mean, there's so many of these perpetrators, like you just said. The perpetrators are mostly building on something that was already founded, and so he was one of the people who were paid to found this. Yeah, go on.
Sure, please go on.
Yeah, so that's why I think discussing him is necessary, because I do know that most people don't discuss AIT. Most people today in the mainstream, AIT does not probably have a lot of uh, value to them. They discuss the impact of AIT. That's what affects everybody in their day-to-day life. The idea of casteism, the idea of the Aryan-Dravidian divide, the idea of which language is older, and why we shouldn't be speaking in Sanskrit and things like that. That's what the debates are about. And yeah, so I guess the perpetrators build on that sort of noise, and then AIT is just some sort of abstract concept to most people who discuss this. And the only person they realize, they know about is probably they'd have to go back to Max Mueller. So
Well,
that's why I think it's
certainly,
sort of
yes.
necessary.
But yeah, I wouldn't disagree. But what I mean is that now, if you do a literature review today in
Mm-hmm.
2022 of this debate, of this entire matter,
Mm-hmm.
sure, let Max Mueller be a footnote. But
Yeah.
the fact is that, okay, Max Mueller had this impact where he put a timeline. He said that, okay, the Veds were composed somewhere after 1200 BC. And that has stuck as a paradigm. So even Max Mueller, though, before his death said that, okay, this was a working timeline. I'm not, I won't die on this hill. But die he did. So now today, if you have to talk about this timeline and have a problem with it, you can't talk to Max Mueller anyway.
Right.
Today, the problem is that why does Michael Witzel still work around the same timeline, even with the evidence, let us say, of Saraswati that we have geologically, that we have from the Mahabharata, etc. That's the more important question today.
I mean,
Today,
I'd
we would
like
have
to
to wonder.
specify here that the evidence for the Saraswati is from NASA satellites, so it's not really debatable at this point.
Yeah, I mean, even the geological evidence was there for a
It
long
was
time.
always
If people
there, but we need right validation, so I'm just specifying US.
I mean, it's evidence from all sorts of angles and linguistically, textually, and now geologically through satellite imagery. So it's more important that why is a scholar like Michael Witzel, who holds great repute and influence today. So today, new generations of historians will just quote something because they've read it in Michael Witzel's paper, as if that's Bible. So what I mean is that let Max Mueller be there in our understanding of what might have been the genesis. But to deal with the problem today, it's not enough just to say, okay, Max Mueller was wrong. We have to wonder, why does someone like Witzel still stick to his narrative, his timelines? Why does Asko Parpola have the narratives that he does? Why does Sheldon Pollock portray Sanskrit and Sanskrit literature in the way that he does? those are today more important questions from this point of view.
What do you think is a good way to counter this? Because I frankly say that they work in a sphere where it's completely Anglophonic, and they also work outside of India, which kind of it's not somewhere where, say, somebody like Talagere will be read, right? So how do you counter those narratives from a place that you can't reach?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I necessarily have that answer. That's where, we have, that's why where we wonder, right, that where is the ecosystem? Why don't we have institutional support here? Why don't we have institutional efforts? Why don't we have that kind of big media and big propaganda power that all nations and civilizations seem to have? So that, I think, is a much longer needle that will have to be moved by coordinated effort. But at the very least, we have to, at least within our means, within our needs, we have to put these things out there. We have to, quote and talk about the works of someone like Talagere, someone like Konrad Elst. There are foreign scholars as well. There's Alexander Semenenko, who's a Russian scholar, Igor Tonoyan Belyayev, who's also a Russian scholar. There's Dr. Nicholas Kazanas, who's now a Padma Shri awardee. So these voices are there. I think, first of all, if you look at online forums, on this issue, first of all, we just need to learn how to behave ourselves. We jump into these kind of debates, even when it's among academics. We come with a lot of vitriol. We come with a lot of aggression. We immediately start accusing everyone of being racist, being anti-Hindu, anti-India, and that puts a lot of people off. So even these Russian scholars that I mentioned, they have the theory, but they don't call it the out of India theory. And they don't do this because they want to disassociate themselves from these Hindutvavadis and these right-wing Hindu extremists. So they call it the out of South Asia theory, and this is how they're taking great pains just to distance themselves from the debate, the politics of the debate, even though what they are articulating is the out of India theory.
Right, of course.
And I think Dr. Nicholas Kazanas has also gone on record that he takes great pains to articulate that, look, I have nothing to do with these Hindutvavadis, because we sometimes just, I don't know, what's the word for it, but we harm our own cause and we harm our own agenda just by our behavior, how we actually argue. So many of us are ignorant about the landscape, the literature, but, I think it's Konrad Elst who said that we're like, the idiot who gate crashes a party and has no idea how to have a conversation. So that's something which we ourselves.
But I think that just sort of a lighter note, these people are the ones that kind of give them the online notoriety they would never have achieved on their own academic platforms, honestly. I believe that unless that sort of vitriol is directed towards somebody, they can't actually come up and say, hey, don't hate me, I'm not really talking about that. Yeah, I'm just, but I'm joking about that. Let's move on to something more real. So I was very excited. I mean, of course, the Sinauli excavations have been going on for quite a long time now, but the more recent, it's not recent anymore, but the documentary with Manoj Bajpayee as narrator, that was it was very nicely made, and I think it's the first time that an archaeological dig, and I mean, there's about a few million of those in our country, right? Every city you go to, it's got some sort of structure that's really old and it's completely neglected and all of that. And this was the first time that somebody documented it in such a consolidated manner and provided those 3D imagery and just offered a view of what might have been, which is so much more interesting to say. Somebody like you and I are intrinsically interested in history, but then a lot of people are not, right? They live in the present world and they live it there every day, and the optics and the aesthetics matter. And if they can't see what they're supposed to imagine, if they can't imagine what they're supposed to see, then, it's not really something they'd be interested in. So something like 3D imagery, which is done for most digs abroad, most of the Western powers, whoever have the means, will do that with all of the churches, etc., that they excavate, or the digs in Scotland, the oldest civilizational I forget, I think Bara. But yeah, all of this is done abroad, but we don't really have that. I guess the ASI is really poor, of course. But I was just thinking that it would be so interesting for students to go onto these sites and actually have that sort of exposure to the tools, of course, but also the 3D imagery where they actually know that, oh, this is what remains, but this is what was originally. So, but yeah, what do you think about education and history? And another question that you can follow with is Sinauli and the sort of civilization that was discovered that is being talked about now is quite different from the other Indic civilizations that have so far been discovered. So what do you make out of those discoveries?
What do you mean quite different from
quite different in the sense that it was a warrior clan, plainly a warrior clan. They had, I think, a lot of them were burials, and there were weapons buried with. It was more like the Viking burial ground, burial site discoveries, right? So yeah, these things are. Everybody sort of homogenizes the Indic civilization into here. There's, if not caste, there's Jati Varna. And then the Aryans, Dravidians, or whatever. But here's a warrior clan where everybody, male, female, even child, they were warriors and they were buried with their weapons. And yeah, so what do you think about the archaeological evidences, and not just of Sinauli, of Rakhigarhi, of everything, all the archaeology that's going on? What do you think we can do with it in order to promote it, in order to educate our the coming generations, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that's happening with these things is that we have realized that we were wrong in the first place to think of even the Indus Valley civilization as some very discrete and distinct aspect or stage of Indian civilization. It was just one period along an existing continuum. And what happens in archaeology is that, narratives come later. It's findings that are reported first, and it's the hard facts of the archaeology. So we have this thing, it's called the OCP culture. And it's called OCP because it means ochre colored pottery. Now, it is called ochre-colored pottery because the archaeologists who first dug out that pottery, it gave off the ochre color on their fingers.
Yes.
So that's the real fact of it. But in our heads, we start thinking, oh, so was there this OCP culture? These two things actually have nothing to do with each other. So just because that pottery gave off a distinct color on the archaeologist's fingers does not mean that it represents a distinct or separate aspect of civilization, So we can gather a lot about material culture, about how people live, but these boxes we create, Sothi Siswal culture, Aharbanas culture, OCP culture, Harappan civilization, these are boxes we are creating. Whereas in reality, and that's where I say that it was a continuum of civilization anyway that was going on, and the Sinauli findings are interesting and important for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think forgive me if I'm wrong on this, but first of all, I don't think the findings have been published in an academic peer review paper yet. So we've read a lot about those findings. We've seen a lot of images. We now have the Discovery Channel mini documentary with Manoj Bajpai, but a full academic paper in a peer reviewed journal is yet to be published. So that's the first thing.
Why?
The second thing.
Why do you think that is?
Again, so those are questions about, that's where we need to be better as a country, right? We need to be coming up with these findings. We need to be sending them to international journals. I can't guess why.
But it can be done at a personal level, right? Like universities can take it up. Indian historians can take it up. It does not have to necessarily have governmental support like that.
No, of course. But I don't know. I think it was an Archaeological Survey of India dig. So yes. I don't know what kind of institutional barriers or,
right.
I mean, look, without getting conspiratorial, it's also possible a lot of times that these findings are held back, that scholars are pressurized. Right. We know that happens in the Proto-Indo-European debate as well. It happened with a scholar named Johanna Nichols, who was forced to retract the obvious conclusions of her study. Once it became obvious that the conclusions point to a further Eastern origin of Proto-Indo-European than even modern Tajikistan, more towards Afghanistan, Pakistan. So that happens at a global level. It happens in all academic fields. It happens in physics, in science, history, everywhere. So maybe that also has a role to play. But more interestingly, what do we know for sure? First of all, we know that we found a true chariot. Now, there is not necessarily evidence that this was horse-pulled, the chariots we found in Sinauli, but we don't need them to be horse-pulled either. So anyway, this whole notion of horse-pulled chariots being this kind of definitive thing of Aryans or the Aryan arrival is anyway red herring. It has no bearing or no platform. But we know it's a chariot for sure. We know of the martial culture because we found weapons, we found short swords. We found copper. So we have evidence of evolved copper metallurgy and weaponry in 1900 BC. So then this date also becomes important, because if we have this kind of what it suggests about how mature and evolved the martial culture was at that time in 1900 BC, we immediately have to ask, okay, so who are these Aryans who came with all of these things 1500 BC later, after 1500 BC? So anyway, it overthrows a lot of that. And then, of course, when we start looking and mapping it to Mahabharata and to what we get from Puranic history, then there is a lot of evidence on the table to suggest that 1900 BC to 1500 BC might be a plausible era for the events of the Mahabharata war. And I'm not trying to make any conclusive timelines here. There are various debates on the table, but there is a whole school of thought with enough substantiation on its side as well, that somewhere between 1900 to 1500 BC is where we could place the Mahabharata war, which means that Sinauli itself, it could be the ancestors of these people who fought the Mahabharata, so to speak. So that also makes it very interesting. Another thing is that, of course, the wheel of the chariot. So the wheel of the chariot, I think, is not spoked. So it's not a spoked wheel. Now, this throws up a different kind of question, because in the Rig Veda itself has a chronology to it. There is something called the early Rig Veda and the later Rig Veda. So spoked wheels come only in the later Rig Veda, and they're absent from the early Rig Veda. So that throws a different question, that if the Rig Veda, what we understand about spoked wheels in that, then Sinauli seems to suggest that it is of the early Rig Vedic era. But if that early Rig Vedic era is 1900 BC, then that throws up different questions about timelines there. So a lot of interesting things to discuss there. But certainly, I don't think we should be quickly to jump the gun. I saw a lot of people talking about, oh, we found a true horse chariot in Sinauli. That's not true at all, because I don't think we found horse bones or horse burials there. So those kind of conclusions are jumping the gun.
Right. So, so there's a lot. I do want to discuss a lot of history and, well, factual history, but also, AIT just does take up so much time, just AIT in itself and all the narratives, counter narratives, etc. So I think we've sort of hit the 1 hour mark, and I'm just going to have to call you back another time, and hope you can make it. But also, I really, really look forward to you starting your own podcast where you discuss all of these things, and I hope that comes on sooner rather than later, so we can get a fairer sense of what the truth is. I know it's become sort of trending to have these discussions, but from a more balanced, sort of, say, reasoned perspective like you bring, right? You don't go in for a political spectrum when discussing history, because history is just that. History is history. It's based on facts and evidence, and it's more science than politics. So just separating all of those, I really look forward to more of that on your podcast as well. But I certainly look forward to having you on again soon on this channel. But thank you so much, Amrit, for joining me today.
Thank you, Sagarika. Thank you for having me, and yeah, it was a delight.
Thank you.